some of those Republican critics have a short memory because, as I recall, I'm inheriting a $1.3 trillion deficit, annual deficit from them. We haven't seen an alternative budget out of them. And the reason is because they know that, in fact, the biggest driver of long-term deficits are the huge healthcare costs that we've got out here that we're going to have to tackle.
President Obama has spent the last week trying to sell his budget plan to the American people, which Americans assuredly will not buy, no matter what he's selling. That would be the tiny little minority of Americans who are Republican members of Congress. Those good folks today went war metaphor crazy. Dare I say it, congressional Republicans had a collective war metaphor-gasm trying to make the president's budget seem scary.
It's very difficult to deal with the aircraft carrier that he's proposing when we're suggesting a destroyer would probably do the job.
He's waving a white flag of surrender on the deficit.
It puts us on the path over 10 years for a very different kind of country, one with less freedom.
No matter how persuasive they are that the president's budget is an advancing foreign army, or a surrendering American soldier, or a bad aircraft carrier, or whatever, the political reality is that the Republicans are such a tiny minority in Washington right now. They have so little power of any real kind in the political system that it just doesn't matter what they think. Mathematically, the Republicans don't really matter. If the president does actually have political trouble passing his budget and his other priorities, it will not be because of anything Republicans have done. They are essentially politically irrelevant now. If the president can't pass his budget and his agenda, it won't be because of Republicans. It will be because of this guy, Evan Bayh. He's a Democrat. Evan Bayh waited through George W. Bush's 2 terms in office. He waited until a Democratic president was elected, and then he formed a group of conservative Democrats in the Senate to oppose his own party's agenda. Under Senator Bayh's leadership, 8 conservative Democrats have written the White House, saying they are siding with the Republican minority and saying that they want it to take more than a majority vote to pass legislation like health care reform and global warming legislation. They, as conservative Democrats, want it to be harder for the president's agenda to pass the Senate. Do I need to say the "with friends like these" line, or are you already thinking it? Today, a group of progressives launched a new initiative to pressure Evan Bayh and the ConservaDems off their course of opposing the president's agenda. Joining us now is one of those progressives, Jane Hampshire, founder and publisher of the very influential blog Fire Dog Lake. Jane, thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
So who are you working with to target Evan Bayh and the ConservaDems, and what's the campaign going to be like?
Well, we're working with Campaign for America's Future and also U.S. Action, trying to take a look at what's really going on in the states and the districts that these people live in. Evan Bayh and others use the cloak of coming from semi-conservative areas in order to justify taking enormous amounts of lobbying money and then blocking legislation that President Obama says the country needs, in his case, states where Obama won handily.
Now, that's alleging that this is because he's taking lobbying money is not necessarily alleging corruption, but you are essentially alleging that he's being paid to pursue this agenda. Is there reason to think that he wouldn't pursue it otherwise, even without those campaign donations?
Well, Evan Bayh has, say, a huge foreclosure crisis in the state of Indiana, and yet right now he is evidently crafting a bill to compete with the cram-down bill that passed the House. That bill would have allowed more, bankruptcy judges to write down the value of mortgages and keep people in their homes. It was estimated that it would have kept people in their homes at 20% of foreclosures at absolutely no cost to the taxpayer. Evan Bayh, on behalf of the banks, is trying to write legislation that won't allow that to happen because they're sitting on the sidelines hoping they get paid much more handsomely by the U.S. government. So he took $123,000 from Goldman Sachs between 2003 and 2008. He took $1 million from securities and investment firms in donations from 2003 to 2008. So yes, people are going to be asking that question. When you've got a real bad problem in your state that could be solved without spending taxpayer money, but the banks don't want it, how come you're the one that they're going to do this?
Jane, the only member of the moderate Democratic caucus that I have talked to since the group was formed is Senator Mark Begich of Alaska, and he wouldn't commit either way on whether he's in favor of letting Republicans filibuster things like health care reform and the global warming legislation. Aside from that issue of what is subject to the filibuster and what could just pass with a majority vote, do you feel like you know at this point what else they're going to be taking the Republicans' side on, what else these conservative Democrats are going to do?
Well, Ben Nelson himself has said that he is going to oppose a provision in the budget that would take the $4 billion that normally goes to student loan underwriting and give it directly to student loans. As it is now, bank entities like Sallie Mae and Nelnet get $4 billion a year essentially for doing nothing. They write student loans, but then the federal government guarantees them. So if any of them go bad, we pick up the tab. So President Obama has rightfully said, let's just take that money and apply it to student loans and stop giving it to a middleman. And they've decided that that this absolutely has to be there. Gone is the language that was used during the auto bailout, where an industry had to be self-sufficient in order to be viable and couldn't depend on government money. But that's exactly what they're defending. So I don't know how it qualifies as fiscal responsibility, but it is very much something that the banks want.
You know, once upon a time, Republicans felt like they had to answer to their conservative base, and Democrats didn't feel like they had to answer to their liberal base. I think that's over. Jane Hampshire, founder and publisher of Fire Dog Lake, thank you for coming on the show tonight.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.